System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' inner city left.
This is the Inner City Left broadcast. Today is Tuesday, January 20th. I am Amin TMK alongside Amoja, Lil Tanky Sumler. Amoja, hello. Happy Tuesday. How are you doing? How are you well? How are things?
Man, out here. Yo, as always, everybody, thank you for joining us. Please, if you are not already actively doing so, like and subscribe to catch all of the episodes. We do a lot of research to bring this knowledge to y'all, and it comes at such risk. So it'll cost you nothing but a little bit of time. Please like and subscribe. As for that, though, I'm good. You know, the world goes on. The great game carries on. And a lot of the people that seem to be lost right now and trying to understand things, again, I think it's just a matter of framing. These things are not beyond human understanding. Like quantum physics is pretty close to beyond human understanding. But great game geopolitics, you just got to have a frame of reference, you know? But it starts with emotional curiosity. And this is something that we as Americans are not always great at, having intellectual curiosity, not knowing and acknowledging what you don't know and allowing, room for that to come in. Me and you, we joke about it often. Like, no one goes up to the muscle-bound guy at the beach and they're like, I'm going to punch you out, because you can see the labors of the physical prowess and the time they've spent developing their body potentially as a weapon, right? The ego never allows that same type of reflection as it comes to intellect, I see it all in the comments too, man. You dirty, blah, blah, blah. Hey, it's whatever, buddy. I'm reading these books, man. That's what I'm on. Even the haters, thanks for checking us out, adding the, engagement. You help us more than you think.
Yeah, it just lets us know that what we're saying is ruffling the right feathers. And at the end of the day, we are just another group that is repurposing the class consciousness of so many people. We use receipts,
right.
We use what's on the ground, and we like the word causality. Why do things happen? Why are things the way that they are? And you have to walk those things back. I know it may be simple to someone like you, Tanky, because like you said, the framework, and that's what we're trying to build with other people. We're trying to build that framework and build the current real time, geopolitics and put those together. So let's start with this, because this is something we have been speaking about a lot because we know, let's go talk about causality. The President Assad, who was the president of Syria, his country was attacked by the ISIS sort of al-Julani group, along with Kurdish forces, and this is sort of all kind of put together, this ragtag bunch by, the United States and Israel, of course, and also Turkey. So let's talk about this, and maybe you can give us some background and your thoughts. So this is from Ahmed Hassan. The Kurds trusted America and Israel. They raised American and Israeli flags. They relied on America and Israel to protect them, and the result was they were sold out and abandoned simply because they were no longer needed. This is the end for those who trust America and Israel. It's always been a tinderbox here in Syria. This is something that I don't want to say like we predicted. It was predicted by many people that this sort of tentative alliance between the Kurds and sort of Julani's forces. I'm going to call them ISIS forces because he was the deputy of ISIS. He had a $10 million bounty on his head, and he named
up until
air
last
quotes,
year.
Named. Yeah,
up until last year.
And named himself president. Named himself president. That's all I'm going to say. Give us an update to some causality. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so I will say this. I remind everybody once again of the first rule of geopolitics. There are no permanent allies, only permanent interest. You have to understand that before you can understand anything else about geopolitics. So that brings us to the Kurds. More than a year ago, on this podcast, you and I had a conversation about what would inevitably happen with the defeat of Assad. Again, nobody's trying to say Assad was a good person, but I can say there was never a $10 million bounty on Assad, right? That didn't happen. Whatever you thought about his governance and ruling of Syria, right? Which, again, if you're not a Syrian, it really should be very little that you have opinions as it goes, especially as an American, because you just don't know a lot about it other than what you heard on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or New York Times, none of which are reputable sources of news. And it's painful to say it, but it has to be said. Now, that brings us to the Kurds. The Kurds have been having a dalliance with the United States and Israel for really at least the last 40 years, right? This goes back much further than this contemporary situation we find ourselves in with Turkey. A little bit about the Kurds. It's important to understand that the Kurds are an ethnic minority that are spread out in a large percentage throughout several countries, all the way up to China, by the way, and we'll circle back to that in just a little bit. But the Kurds predominantly exist in Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Iran. The United States has long since teased the Kurds with some sense of national status kind of recognition, right? And it's because of that the Kurds were willing to go against Saddam and largely infiltrate what was happening in the Iraqi situation. This goes, again, see how far back this goes? And we're talking about Saddam Hussein, right? And this goes back to, everybody's heard the propaganda, right? And people are not immune to propaganda. America's propaganda is the best in the world. I say that as an American, but we've all heard the stories of how Saddam gassed his own people, right? Those people were the Kurds. The Kurds do not see themselves as Iraqi. The Iraqis do not see themselves as Kurds. This is not trying to make that better, make that worse, any of those things. This is just simply pointing out facts. Kurds live in Iraq. They don't consider themselves Iraqi. Kurds live in Syria. They don't consider themselves Syrian. Kurds live in Turkey, and they live in Iran. What they consider themselves more than any other thing is Kurdish. And they have wanted to create a Kurdistan for decades. And even people like John Bolton, right, have teased and strung them along with the belief that this is possible. Now, it doesn't take a lot of tugging on this string to see why Kurdistan as a nation is all but impossible, right? It would force, right, land away from Iran, maybe not the world's biggest deal as far as Americans go. It would force land away from Iraq, again, probably not the biggest deal as most Americans go. Syria, right? But here's the clincher. It would force land away from Turkey, and Turkey is a NATO member. More than any other thing, Tayyip Erdogan's biggest pressing issue is maintaining the strength and sovereign power of Turkey, right? This is why he's tried to become part of the EU. All of these things that make Turkey bigger, right? Of which he's been rebuffed, by the way, consistently, repeatedly. Though he is a member of NATO, he is not a member of the EU. Turkey is not a member of the EU. And this is his biggest thing, more than any other thing, right? More than protecting the Palestinians or giving speeches about how bad Israel is. More than any other thing, Tayyip Erdogan's situation is, I will not allow Kurdistan to happen. Like, if you want to understand one thing about Erdogan, that is the single most important thing to understand about this man, right? And this is why, and we were talking about in the last broadcast, why Erdogan reached out to the Iranians, right, and provided them intelligence about the Kurdish uprising that was happening in Iran. Again, everyone says, "Oh, this was a native uprising in Iran." Right? Well, I mean, these people live in Iran, sure. But again, the Kurds in Iran do not see themselves as Iranian, not Iranian first. A good portion of them don't. And this is why they've always been fertile ground, okay, for infiltration, right? You can reach out to these guys and get them to do things under the hope of, in this new world, it'll be better. More than a year ago on the Inner City Left, we told you when Assad was defeated that war was inevitable between the Kurdish army, right, and the army that was led by the guy who now calls himself Giuliani. Okay, so I want to read a little bit of this from antiwar.com. Okay, full SDF mobilization as ceasefire between Syria and the Kurds are in tatters. The ceasefire between the Kurdish SDF and the Syrian army seems to be completely in tatters Tuesday, as the SDF General Command called on full mobilization of their forces in ongoing attacks by the military on their territory in northeast Syria. So when you think about the dissolution of Syria, it's too simple to be like, oh, they were defeated by the rebels, right? The rebels were being funded tooth and nail by the West, by America, by Israel, right? Because defeating Assad was the single most important geopolitical goal as far as that goes. You have to remember that Syria has been the land bridge that's often been rumored to be utilized for weapon shipments between Iran and the Lebanese resistance, right? So by taking Syria off the board, by taking Assad off the board, which whatever you think about Assad, please understand this was the only real reason he was removed, is to make it harder for Lebanese resistance, right? For Palestinian resistance to continue to be armed. This is undeniable. The Americans acknowledge it. The Israelis acknowledge it. It's only American liberals that continue to kind of perpetrate this fantasy of like, oh, Assad, he was gassing the people, right? They just take the same lie from the Saddam conversation and apply it again, because Americans, again, are not immune to propaganda, especially propaganda that you hear enough. So if you hear Rachel Maddow say it, oh my God, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Then you hear it on Fox News and it's like, man, I don't really listen to them, but I heard it on Rachel, right? You hear it enough and it becomes a truth. New York Times repeated it. Oh, right. Obama famously said that was his one red line with Assad. And then a week later it happens, right? Even though the Russians had already verified they destroyed the Syrian chemical weapons that existed. This was all documented at the United Nations. Nobody wants to press this too hard. And again, we're all invested on the American liberal side of trying to see the best in Obama. So like when these things happen, it's like, well, he had to have a reason. The reason was American hegemony does not change, regardless as to the party. So the Kurds find themselves now in this awkward position where they thought they would have the protection of the Americans and the Israelis, and to a degree they do, right? They have use. But the fact of the matter is, you have to remember that al-Jawlani, as much as he is many people's man, he is Erdogan's man in Syria, right? And so this is just nothing more than really a continuation of his policy against the Kurds that he has maintained for over 20 years of Turkish public service. You know what I'm saying? The moment that he gave the word to the Iranians that the Kurds were going to have that uprising, he gave the word to his men in Syria, Giuliani et al., right? And they began the assault on the Kurdish forces. And these are just things that continue to happen, right? So when you ask about like who is, well, I want to come back to that a little bit later, but that's the Kurds, right? And that is why they have found themselves in this position. Erdogan is not going to allow Kurdistan. That's the TLDR. He will do all kinds of things. This has forced him into weird alliances. Forced is a strong word because Erdogan is a slippery ass dude, right? But when it became convenient, he reached out to the Iranians because they're doing the work that he wants done. There's probably no one he is more anti than the Kurds. And this just provides him another opportunity to make that happen. And that's what you're seeing happen in Syria. Now, who those Assadists, who the people who were removed by the Assadists, that's a whole nother conversation. And it's a lot bigger than you think. But I'm pretty sure we'll probably circle back to that later on in the epi.
I'm just gonna move on here. Show some videos. So we've been talking a little bit about Greenland and how that's kind of coming about. This is the prime minister, new prime minister of Canada, Mark Carney. So this is sort of, an interesting juxtaposition that you have, because Trump has already talked about Canada being a 51st state. We know, Denmark is a NATO member, so it's putting everybody in a little bit of a tough situation. But this was Canada's prime minister today.
We stand.
Denmark hurt me with this. All right, let's go ahead and.
We stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future. Our commitment to NATO's Article 5 is unwavering. So we're working with our NATO allies, including the Nordic Baltic Cape, to further secure the alliance's northern and western flanks, including through Canada's unprecedented investments in over-the-horizon radar, in submarines, in aircraft, and boots on the ground. Boots on ice. Canada strongly opposes tariffs over Greenland and calls for focused talks to achieve shared objectives of security and prosperity in the Arctic.
So that was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. That was today. Again, I just think it's an interesting place for a lot of people to be in. There's been, of course, more rhetoric by, people like Macron, what's the fascist lady in Italy. She's also mentioned
Maloney.
It's kind of put Maloney. It's kind of put everybody in this weird position. I won't talk too much about some of the other things that we have or whatever, but your thoughts on, what the prime minister said? What are your thoughts on what's happening in Greenland? Like what's really going on here?
Yeah, again, what we're seeing is empty rhetoric, right? First off, Article 5 conversation is a guarantee in NATO. Article 5 means an attack on one is an attack on all. But what's implied in there is an attack from someone outside of the alliance. Like theoretically, if Israel was to attack Turkey, right, that would be an Article 5. The reality of what would really happen is quite a different scenario, right? But on paper, that's what should happen. However, inside of NATO, there is no framework for what happens. And for more than 50 years, there has been a framework that has pretty much said what happens between NATO countries is not an Article 5 worthy offense. And how do we know this, right? Because NATO has never made a strong stance that's explicitly stated so. There is conflict between two NATO members as it stands, Greece and Turkey. This is the reason why they were both admitted the same time. You know what I'm saying? Because Greece and Turkey have had long-riding historical conflicts as to property, right? Cyprus is a great example. The Turkish claim access and sovereignty to Cyprus. The Greeks also do so. They have went to war over this land, right? And the fact that NATO has never stepped in to have an explicit, we will come to the defense of Greece if attacked, or we will come to Turkey, right? They've never said this. And that laid the groundwork then for where we are now with America laying claim to all of these things. Look, I think another thing worth mentioning is the fact that the Democrats are being useful idiots. And people that vote Democrat are being useful idiots when they talk about Greenland. It's without any type of nuance. They say, oh, Trump is insane. But you haven't heard any Democratic senator or a member of the House of Representatives talk about ensuring that impeachment will happen or that there will be investigations into the Trump White House if he were to continue to pursue this course of action. And that's because though Trump is the person that goes out and is boisterous and says these things, he is just being impolitic about overriding hegemonic urges that the United States have. We need to be honest. The United States has essentially claimed, first off, implicitly they stated control of the Americas with the Monroe Doctrine, which is not like some official policy. It's not like something that is a treaty that has been signed by the Senate. There's nothing that binds the United States to this course other than it's just something they choose to pursue. So that's something to understand about the Monroe Doctrine. But now explicitly, right, we are in a place where Donald Trump is laying essentially claim to this hemisphere. This is why he has asked, Canada to join the United States. This is why he's building a wall on the southern border, right? Mexico is not invited to be part of the United States, but Canada is. Ask yourself what the differences are. I don't have to spell that out for you. But he wants to continue with that expansion, right? All the way up to Greenland. He wants to shut this hemisphere down, right? Exclusively to the pursuits of what the American government wants to do. And though Democrats act like they are opposed to this, they're not. There's no single Democrat that has said explicitly, this will be the end of the Trump presidency if he continues onwards, right? We don't get that kind of strong language. Even NATO is not giving you that kind of language. The Canadian Prime Minister did not use that kind of language. He's saying, this is wrong. These are appeals to morality. Trump has already explicitly stated he is only bound to his morality. He doesn't feel bound by international law. He doesn't feel bound by any of those dictates, and explicitly said, because I was not given the Nobel Peace Prize, I am not bound to seek peace out anymore. This is a man that was responsible for bombing more than 7 countries and interfering in conflicts around the world and participating in a genocide, being unhappy that somehow he wasn't awarded this totally fugazi award that honestly mostly only bad people ever win anyway, right? You have Machado, who's calling for the bombing of Venezuela. There was a previous Nobel laureate who is calling for the bombing of Iran, right? See the things that they have in common. And this is what's interesting for a peace prize, right? The thing that these people normally have is they are willing to be useful idiots that provide political cover to allow American hegemony to do what it wants to do anyway, which is be dominant, right? Like, this is sans goodness or badness. This is just a reality, right? The language that NATO needs to be saying right now is, we will remove the United States from NATO should they pursue this course of action. But NATO understands that they cannot do that. One, even if they did so, they don't have the might to stop the American military from taking Greenland by force. That's one. Two, they don't wish to see the dissolution of NATO because they understand America is the teeth of NATO. Russia has no fear of Europe at all. At all. Like, the only thing the Europeans could present to NATO right now is nuclear weapons. And Russia has far more. They have better delivery systems, right? Talking about the Budapest system, the Orishnik, they did the math, and they're like, oh my God, who was it? I think it was the, I can't remember the name of the premier, so I won't get too deep into it, but just doing the trajectory of like how long it would take an Oreshnik to reach continental United States, and it was something like 30 minutes, and like at the 11 minute, it would be over Greenland. But that's still beside the point, because even if America had Greenland, and they already have military bases in Thule, which is, a city at the top of Greenland, right? They don't have missile defense that's capable of dealing with a system like Orishnik. And Orishnik is only one of their systems, perhaps not even the fastest of their systems. They still have the Zircon hypersonic system, which is rarely used. They have the Orishnik. They have the Burevestnik, which may not be as fast as the Orishnik. They have what is the Sarmac system, right? So they have several systems that are already much faster than missile defense as it exists. right? American missile defense isn't even necessarily perfectly capable of stopping Iranian tech, which we saw in the so-called 12-day war. The Russians and the Chinese have systems that are far more advanced than the Iranians have. So even having Greenland under the auspice of having it for missile defense isn't 100% the best way to look at it. The way to understand Greenland truly is once again looking at the great game politics. Why do they want Greenland? The Americans already have choke points. The American Navy has choke points on pretty much every way that the Chinese can move their goods economically, right? There's a choke point that they never planned for, and that is the new routes that are becoming available as the Arctic ice melts. The Russians, with their nuclear icebreakers, have created lanes where now there's only 2 or 3 months of the year where they cannot ensure cargo going across the north, right? So what happens is Chinese goods are able to use freight trains to get their goods to areas on the northern coast of Russia. And then from there, they're moved out in cargo ships. You're able to cut thousands of kilometers off of these routes and get your products to the market faster through this new Arctic lane. The Americans want Greenland and they want Canada so that they too can have access to these commercial lanes, but more importantly, the ability to project power across them. As it stands right now, the Americans don't have a real way to project power across those Arctic lanes. That changes with taking Greenland, right? You can put up a much more robust naval presence there that can begin interdict shipments that they see as illicit, which we now know, looking at the Venezuelan situation, anything that the Americans unilaterally claim, right, is illicit becomes illicit. Whether we're talking about oil, whether we're talking about narcotics, any product, right? And it's important to remember that these sanctions are not United Nations sanctions. These are often just unilateral sanctions that the United States have. And if American banks say this, then if you want to do business in dollars, you have to follow through, right? And this is just, again, this is a result of the Bretton Woods agreement throughout Europe and their continued agreement with most of the Arab world, which allows for the petrodollar to be based on American dollars, backed by that, that goods internationally are traded in dollars, right? All of this is connected. Like, without understanding great game politics, you cannot get here. So the whole language is misunderstanding the seriousness of the intent. Whether we have Trump have this happen or the next president that comes through, this Greenland conversation is not going away. Like, as we've already said on the show, realistically, the Americans will probably attempt to buy it. They've tried to extort it, right, by putting, a 10% tax, or is it a 15% tariff on all of the nations that have vocally opposed this so far, right? France, Germany, Denmark, Poland, England, the UK, right? Because they're like, look, give us Greenland, right? They're actually making the Europeans pay them, right, to not take Greenland. And so now when they offer the financial award, whatever that is, it's going to be a face-saving award, right? It's not going to be like, you and I have talked about it. It's not going to be some astronomical number, $700 billion. It's not going to be that. It's going to be enough money for Europe to save face, right, and avoid a military confrontation that they cannot win and have little interest in, because Europe still needs to pretend they're equal partners with the United States. And though the American foreign policy is showing them in every way that it can, you're not us. I mean, Scott Bessent, right, for God's sake, has already said Americans project strength, Europeans project weakness.
Sergei Lavrov spoke, and I think that it's probably a good idea just to ask this question, because I think he's asking the question that a lot of us are asking. So yeah, if you watch the show, you know who Sergei Lavrov is, Russian foreign minister. And this was him earlier. I think this was yesterday.
NATO and the OSCE are Euro-Atlantic entities, and they feel a dire crisis. NATO. Currently, there are discussions ongoing within NATO whether it's time to shut it down because one NATO member intends to attack another NATO member, but that's a different story.
Now, I know you mentioned the Turkey and Greece, conflict over Cyprus, obviously something else. But this does feel like a little bit different, right? I mean, there is sort of this NATO breaking point that we've already been hearing about for a while now, especially when it comes to the special military operation in Ukraine. And there is a lot of work that needs to be done if NATO is to be viable, and Europe doesn't really have the money. It doesn't have the technology. It doesn't really have much. So, Foreign Minister Lavrov saying, hey, this could be another breaking point in NATO. Some people say that NATO is basically the United States. Where does this leave NATO?
So I'm going to give you a basketball question because you're much better at basketball than I am. Name a team. I think I have one. I think Minnesota would be a great example. What is the strength of the Minnesota Timberwolves without Giannis? What would you say their strength is? Like, where would you rate them as their power? Like, without Giannis, would they be Milwaukee? Milwaukee, my bad. See how bad I am at this? Milwaukee. What would be their strength without Giannis? Right?
Yeah, they wouldn't have. They would be a far below average team, probably one of the worst teams in the league. They would certainly have NBA players and things that are, capable of winning a few games here or there, but certainly wouldn't be a contender in any way.
I would say this is the way that NATO views, America views NATO, right? They're the Bucks, and the Americans are Giannis. But the problem is the Europeans see themselves more as like the dream team. Like all of us, you got Jordan on here, you got Magic Johnson, you got Bird. We're all great, right? No one player is greater than the other. The Americans don't have that view. The Americans see themselves as the heart and soul of NATO. The Americans probably see, and probably not incorrectly, so America could probably defeat all of NATO combined. Especially if America fought NATO the way America fought Japan, right? Like no gloves off type situation, America would probably easily defeat NATO. They're not peers. Like all of Europe combined is not a peer to the United States. It's certainly not militarily a military peer. They're barely an economic peer, and less, right? Especially since the special military operation and the self-imposed gunshot wounds to the European economy by giving up on cheap Russian gas. And in some cases, like Germany, also giving up nuclear power. Like, what a time to go off nuclear power. Like the same time you're going off cheap Russian oil. Right, it's destroyed the European economy, but the European military was never very powerful without the Americans. And that's what we're finding, right? That's where we are as that relates. I don't think the Americans need NATO nearly as much as Europe needs NATO. And Europe understands without the Americans, there is no NATO. So this is why, for all of the tough talk, if they're not threatening to kick the Americans out of NATO and to go to war to defend Greenland, which they are not, they're going to lose. They're going to find an amount of money they can deal with. And again, it just seems like lunacy. It just sounds like Trump lunacy unless you understand continuation of agenda, which is something that goes beyond any American president. The control of this hemisphere is a program and a project that goes far beyond Republicans or Democrats. It is the state itself seeking to defend itself. And it feels like this is the best way. And it's completely in keeping with American excess, right? Like, it bothers Americans that they are the third largest nation, right? In the American soul, that, because you have to be number one, right? You certainly can't beat third, right, behind America, behind Russia, behind Canada. But if you absorb Canada and you absorb Greenland, now without a doubt, you're the largest country in the world, right? And it also provides you access to resources. But the resources are just secondary because they already have access to most of the resources of Canada. They have access to most of the resources of Greenland because they're already structurally aligned and commercially aligned. They have access to all of these things in name. But for the Americans, it's never enough to just control a thing in name. Power is something that is executed and demonstrated. And this is a demonstration of American power. And that's what you're about to see. And again, without understanding that all of this is meant to be part of great game politics, right? Something to once again ensure the Chinese don't have the economic strength that they would gain from serving the European markets, right? And you can assure that by blocking the Straits of Malacca, by blocking the Bering Straits, by commandeering the Sinai Canal if you need to, de facto already controlling the Panama Canal, right? America's Navy has controlled the waterways for the past 100 years. That's unquestioned. There's only areas that didn't exist that Americans never thought to guard. And that's what leads us to Greenland. This is one of the potential future choke points that the Americans hadn't thought to ensure, right? And now that is happening. I did want to circle back. We talked a little bit about it, about who are these forces, right? Who are these forces that are in Syria? Okay. So one of the conversations I hear a lot in the West is, you can't be for China, which, by the way, we're not for China. We're not for any country or against any country on inner city left. We are here to talk about geopolitics. Okay. So one of the groups that you'll hear a lot about are the Uyghurs, right? And, the quote unquote Uyghur genocide. You have to understand how much of an op all of that conversation is. Is that to say that there isn't excess that happens? Certainly it is, but not nearly to the extent that we have been told in the Americas. You have to remember that there are only 11.5 million Uyghur, all right, in the Xinjiang province. They make up less than 1% of the Chinese population. Now, compare and consider, right, the population of Black people in the United States of America, far higher. Look at the rates of imprisonment of Black Americans, right, in the United States, far, far higher, right? And under the illusionary imaginations of violence in the inner city, right? Black, dangerous, super criminals, which were sold from Republicans, were sold this from Democrats, right? But when you talk about the Uyghurs, right, though you hear one conversation politically, right, you hear one conversation on the media, right, even within the United States, there is an acknowledgement of Uyghur terrorism. So I want to read once again, this is directly from West Point, okay, the training bastion of American military leadership. Okay, this is a small thing that they wrote a while ago. On October 28th, 2013, a new phase of terrorist violence emerged in China. On that day, a man drove a Jeep packed with explosives and carrying his wife and mother into a crowd in Tiananmen Square. In the country's capital, Beijing, 2 civilians were killed in the incident along with the driver and 2 other passengers, the latter of whom were all ethnic Uyghurs from China's western province in Xinjiang. Following the attack, Abdul Mansour, the leader of the Pakistan-based and Uyghur-led Turkestan Islamic Party, released a propaganda video praising the plotters and warned of future attacks. Now, it's worth noting, even in the United States, according to the State Department, the Turkish Islamic Party is a terrorist organization. They are listed as a terrorist organization by the American State Department as it stands, okay? But these are the same people that they want you to believe are just innocent freedom fighters. These are the same people that make up the Al-Julani army, right, in Syria right now. So what you're talking about is people that have been radicalized to an extreme point of view. This is clearly not all Uyghurs, right? Just as there's no all of anything for any ethnic group. However, this minority of an extreme minority in China are extremely dangerous, as is even noted, right, by the Americans, by West Point themselves. The article continues. The attack carried enormous symbolic significance as it took place meters from the giant portrait of Chairman Mao Zedong that hangs outside the main entrance to the Forbidden City in the heart of Beijing. On the west side of the square stands the Great Hall of the People, where a meeting of the plenary session of the Chinese Communist Party was planned. Chinese authorities believe that since 1990, there have been 6 stages of terrorism in Xinjiang, and that over this time period, the TIP's capabilities to include its tactics, target selection, geographic reach, and international connections have evolved and grown, and it is a danger and has the danger it poses in the country. It is the opinion of the author that the Tiananmen Square attack served as the initiation of the 7th stage of Uyghur-linked terrorism, a stage that will now include attacks outside of the traditional areas of Xinjiang. And again, you can go to the westpoint.edu website and look up 7th stage of terrorism in China. This is coming from the United States, right? So even though the State Department says something different, when you find yourself quoting Marco Rubio, just take a step back and ask yourself what is happening. Because from a military point of view, the United States absolutely sees the danger of the TIP, of what they of what they have done and the threat that they pose, right? Overall, Uyghurs are included in the Grand Assembly, the Chinese National Assembly, at a much larger percentage, by the way, than you would expect for their percentage of the population. There is unrest, right? But it's only because of these people. I refuse to say only because. It's by and large because of the extremists that have sold their skills all around the world, right? And where this is the highlight is Syria. Syria is, right now you have a Syria that's ruled as a Islamic, they want to be a caliphate, right? That is composed of Sunni and what is the other sect? TMK, you're much better than me. The Sufis. It's the Sunnis and the Sufis that make up these sects. And again, it's a very small percentage of the Uyghur population, but it is a noted thing that interacts with the United States in a number of different ways. The State Department deals with these guys in a very different way than Department of Defense. I will remind you that the Department of Defense was fighting against these guys as they were fighting against Assad. The State Department was working with these guys, right? Because it was a race to see who could topple Assad the first. So all of these things are connected. This episode is going on a little bit long, but we're in such a dangerous stage of what is happening with the wars, and people have consistently been asking, what is going on with the Greenland situation. All of these subjects are 100% connected. So.
There's already been conversations surrounding the idea that, well, we have to take Greenland because Russia and China want to take it, which of course is just absurd. And it's just more propaganda towards China and the China bad idea. And this is China's already come out several times and been like, look, this is against international law. We practice international law. We have no interest in Greenland. Everyone knows we have no interest in Greenland. But as long as you throw that narrative out there, people listen to it. They buy into it. And they run with it, especially throwing the same thing in with sort of the protests in Hong Kong, which they didn't, folks didn't understand at the time. And no one wants to talk about sort of the way that China has remedied that already. Everyone wants to talk about sort of Taiwan, but no one is talking about many of the Taiwanese are already kind of fed up with this separatist movement. So a lot of the things that people utilize when it comes to the bad of China is still kind of grasping at straws, especially when they live in the West, or if you live in the United States. Focus on yourself, worry about yourself. I want to give a shout out to our podcast listeners. We're available everywhere you find podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all that good stuff. Well, not that Spotify and Apple Podcasts is good stuff, but platforms exist and we have to utilize them the way that we have to. Give a shout out to our Patreon members, patreon.com/innercityleft. To where all the hotness is. You can talk to us, send us notes, all those good things. Learn about what we do, some behind the scene things, and of course, all our videos. Fables, Foibles, Other American Sins, available in the description. Me and TMK and Lil Tanky everywhere you find music. Tanky, what did we miss? Final thoughts, final feelings. What's the vibe?
I just want to remind everybody, when you have questions for us, specifically genuine questions, the Patreon is the best place to drop those. Anybody with those questions in the Patreon, we definitely try to make a big effort to come back to those and address them directly because we respect y'all so much. Y'all are the ones that make this possible. You know what I'm saying? And it really, y'all are the MVPs, man. Y'all are the Giannis's on my squad.
That's a fact. For Amoja, Lil Tanky Summer, I'm me and TMK. This is the Inner City Left broadcast. Peace.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' Inner City Left.